Welcome to this slow stitching and tutorial video that I thought I might film for you for the Connecting Hearts Sew Along. The Connecting Hearts Sew Along is something I decided to do on a bit of a whim last month, and I posted on Instagram to see if anyone would be keen to do a sew along with me where we stitch jewel hearts into a quilt. And very happily and surprisingly, quite a few of you really wanted to join in. So I thought, okay, well, let's do it then. So we officially kicked off the sew along on the 1st of May, which was 2 days ago now, filming this on the 3rd. And we're running the sew along through until the end of August. This is very much a stitch at your own pace sew along. It's very casual. We're connecting using the Connecting Hearts EPP hashtag on social media. And the one thing that I really hope we all get to do during this sew along is not just make beautiful heart quilts using jewel paper templates, but also connecting with each other. I'm sure if you are doing this craft, English paper piecing, then you do it because of the joy and the love that you get from it. And as we stitch, though, that joy and that love is stitched into our quilts. And so by connecting with each other, we can share that love and we can share that joy. And so that's why I decided to call it the Connecting Hearts Sew Along. So today what I wanted to do was a bit of a tutorial on how I go about creating my jewels. So I'm going to talk about fabric selection, cutting your fabric, basting your jewel templates, piecing your heart block, and then also how to piece your heart blocks together. So I hope you have a nice cup of tea or other beverage of choice, some sweet snacks, and let's get stitching. So the first thing you're going to want to do is select your fabrics. Now I am going for a scrappy look, but when I create my scrappy look, I want to create a harmonious scrappy look. So I've chosen my sort of favorite color palette, which is pretty pastels. Sort of not really pale pastels, there's a little bit of them, but sort of that nice in between bright and soft pastels, I guess. So this is where I'm up to at the moment. So let's talk about how I go about choosing my fabric. So the first thing you're going to want to do is choose a variety of different tones across your fabric. So you're going to want slightly brighter to slightly softer. That gives it a scrappy quilt a nice sort of movement through the quilt. And you're going to want to pick different variants of patterns. So you're going to want some larger scale patterns as well as smaller scale patterns. And then you're going to want to actually look at the type of pattern as well. So for example, this pattern is a small scale pattern, but it shows a lot of background fabric. This is also a small scale pattern, but it shows less of the background fabric. Then you've got something like this, which doesn't show hardly any of the background fabric. So these things as well add to that harmonious look when you sort of mix them through your quilt. The other thing that I always like to make sure I include are low volume fabrics. So some things like this. And they then play very nicely against your more saturated and brighter fabrics. The other thing I like to also always include in a scrappy project are solid fabrics. These give the place an eye to rest as they look at the quilt and add to that harmonious flow through the quilt. I use a lot of florals. I love floral fabrics, but sometimes too many floral fabrics is just a little bit too much. So as well as the solids, I like to add in just some simple sort of geometric. So I like to use ginghams, stripes and spots as well to get my scrappy look. And you can see even when I'm choosing these, I choose softer ones, slightly deeper ones, so that I get tonal variation in those as well. So once we have our fabric chosen and we have our paper templates, then we need the tools to create our hearts. So for basting, I like to use the Sew Line glue pen. You could also thread baste, although thread basting a 1.5 inch is a little bit, it's doable, but I find when I baste really big shapes by thread basting that my folds, when I fold them over my seams, they're just a little bit loose, because unless you're thread basting through the paper, which I don't recommend, this stitch between this point and this point, this basting stitch with thread, is going to be quite big, and so this seam is not going to be held tightly against your paper. So that's why I like to glue baste, because it means that my seams are all folded nice and tight, not too tight, but tight enough so that my shape is not all floppy and it doesn't sort of lose its shape. So you're going to want your basting tool. Then you're going to want your needle and thread. So if you're going for a scrappy look or using a wide variety of fabrics like I am, I recommend using just a really nice neutral thread. I always stitch with the Superior Threads bottom line thread in colour Statue. It's a 2-ply polyester thread and it's a 60 weight thread. And the reason I like this thread is because it just seamlessly blends in with pretty much any fabric I put it with. And because it's such a fine thread, my stitches don't show on the front either. And I like not to be able to see my stitches. I pair this thread with a milliner's size 11 needle. And I like this needle because it is a long needle, it's thin and sharp, and the eye is small, and the eye is the same thickness as the shaft of the needle. If you're using a needle that has quite a large eye, and that the eye is larger than the shaft of the needle, what you're going to find is that that is going to pull apart the fibers of the fabric, and your stitches are more likely to show on the front. So that's why I like to use this needle. Now, I always say it is an absolute matter of preference. If you want to stitch with cotton thread, then I recommend finding a 60 or 50 weight thread. Confetti by Wonderful is really good for that, as is Afina, and also Aurifil have I think it's a 50 weight cotton thread that works very well as well. But you want a fine cotton thread, and you want a lint-free cotton thread as well. And then you're going to want to just try and find a needle that doesn't have a really big eye on it. So I kind of wouldn't recommend sort of an embroidery needle that's too large of an eye, because you're just going to pull those fibers apart and you're not going to get the stitching look that you want, especially if you don't want to see the stitching on the front. So, but always stitch with something that you feel comfortable with. If you struggle threading a needle that has a really small eye, then do go up a needle size and go up an eye size, but just be really conscious of your stitching then. And I'll talk a little bit more later in the tutorial about how I stitch as well, because the method that I stitch also helps me with having invisible stitching on the front. So after you've got your pen and you've got your thread and your needle chosen, other than that, obviously you're just going to want to have a little pair of embroidery scissors or snips with you so you can snip your threads. You're going to want some fabric cutting scissors to cut out your fabric, and you're going to want to keep all of your bits together in something as well. So you will have seen at the start of this video, I upgraded this project from a little fabric sewing caddy that I had to my customary, what is becoming customary to me anyway, basket. So if you follow me on Instagram, you will know that I have developed a bit of a problem for thrifting baskets and collecting them, and I have since put all of my baskets at the top of the wardrobe in my studio now, and they look quite nice up there. So I'm glad that I finally have a home for them that also looks good. But I decided to upgrade to a basket. And then I also found these, they're cake tins. I found these heart-shaped cake tins at my local thrift shop. I've got 2 of them, one slightly smaller. And I thought, well, I'm working on my heart project, so what better receptacle to put my hearts in than my heart tin? So I've got my pieced blocks ready to go in the larger one. In this one, I have all my random, just single ones. So when we make this quilt, at some point we will need to sort of tidy up the edges, and for that you are going to need a selection of just single jewels so that we can sort of tidy up the edges and then trim them back a bit. So all of my sort of like just random single jewels are in that container. And then I also have just a Ziploc bag, which I've got my unbasted jewels and some of the fabrics that I've sort of pulled out to use in here as well. And so I can keep all those things in my basket. Pop them all in there, and my quilt as well. And then I'm ready to go. I can take my basket with my project around the house because I stitch a lot in the lounge room in front of the TV at night. I can take it outside. I can take it to my daughter's fizzy on a Monday afternoon. I can take it to a cafe when I'm catching up with a friend. So that's why I love to use my baskets. So yeah, so once you have your project sorted, you've got all your bits. Next, we're going to talk about how to cut your fabric. Okay, so I've moved over to my cutting table to show you how I go about cutting my fabric for my jewels. So I've ironed my piece of fabric, and what I like to do is cut strips. So I have found that a 2.5 inch strip, so it's 2.5 inches there, gives me a nice amount of seam allowance for my jewel. And with the seam allowance, you want to go no less than 1/4 of an inch. I actually tend to go just a little bit more. I find it just gives me a little bit more fabric to play with on the back of the seam, and it's just a little bit more comfortable to baste. So I sort of do more about a sort of a 3/8 inch of a seam allowance, especially on the larger shapes. So I'm going to cut my 2.5 inch strip. Now, the one thing that you're going to want to be conscious of when you're preparing your fabric and cutting your strips, if you're doing it like this, or even if you're just hand holding your fabric and cutting, is the direction of the fabric. So you can see here I have a very directional fabric. We're working with a stripe, and we want our paper template to sit on our fabric in the direction that our heart is going to be. So for example, let's get this one here. This is one that I haven't stitched yet. You can see this is how the heart is going to look, and you can see the direction of the paper template is with the point pointing down and the shorter sides up here, because this is the shape of our heart. So when you're working with a directional fabric, you're going to want to make sure that the direction of the fabric is going in the same direction as the heart piece or the jewel piece. Okay, so now that I've got my strip of fabric ready, I'm going to switch to using my scissors. Now make sure you want to use a nice pair of fabric scissors for this. And what I'm going to do is just hold my paper up to my fabric, and I'm going to just snip across like that. And then I'm going to cut down the sides. like so. So that's my 1/2 of my jewel. Now for the next one, you can see that when I was holding my paper, I held it, I did the right side of my heart. So now I'm going to switch. I'm going to turn my paper over to, so I'm cutting the left side. Now when you actually go to baste, your left side is going to turn out to be your right side, and your right side will turn out to be your left side. So again, I'm just going to snip across. And then I'm going to cut my edges off. Like so. And now I have my 2 halves to my heart. So even when I'm working with an all over pattern that doesn't sort of really have a strong sense of direction, I still like to place my paper template onto my fabric in the way that the heart runs. And I'm still going to snip around like I did before, cutting those bits off. Okay. And then again, I'm going to switch and I'm going to do the other side. So I'm going to change the direction of my heart on my fabric. And cut that one the same around as well. Okay, so now we're going to move on to the basting step. So when it comes to basting, you're going to want to have to look at your two hearts and see which way they best go together. So even though we have cut them directionally, we can swap them around and we can create very different looks. Now this is a very large scale all over print, so I could have it so that it sits this way, or I could switch it around and have it so that it sits this way. Now remember that 1/4 inch of this is going to come away, so you're going to want to think about that as well. So while it looks a bit odd having these two leaves together now, once I actually baste them, it's actually going to almost pattern match up almost, or it's going to look a bit different. Same as if I do it this way, you've got to remember that you're going to lose this sort of strip here down the middle, and again it will make it look very different as well. So I need to decide which way I'm going to do this one, if I'm going to go this way or this way. I'm going to lose that and I'm going to lose that, so that will make it, I think I'm going to do this one this way. So now that I've decided I'm ready to baste, what I'm actually going to do is I'm going to turn this one over here, I'm going to turn this one over here, and then I'm going to get my paper template and we're going to baste. So when I'm basting a jewel, I start at the bottom here, or the middle of the 3 shorter edges, and I'm going to do a line of glue across, and I like to do just a little bit on the fabric as well. Then I'm going to fold that over and finger press it down nice and neat, and then I'm going to work my way anti-clockwise around the shape. So I'm going to do the next line there, and I'm going to fold and press that over. I'm going to rotate my shape. Next line of glue, I'm going to fold that over. Now when I'm folding it over, I want to make sure that I get nice crisp edges and points. So I'm folding it over, and I'm folding it quite tightly, but not so tight that I'm not going to be able to get my needle to glide over that paper edge. Work my way around. And then I'm going to do the very last edge. Make sure that's all pressed down. And so there's my first half. That's actually going to be this half. So then I'm going to do the same thing again. And you can see how quick glue basting can be as opposed to thread basting. One of the reasons why I do like to glue baste, especially when I'm doing the bigger shapes and when I've got a lot to do. There we go. So that's my 2 halves. So again, that's how I think I'm going to stitch them together. But with a pattern like this, you can switch them around and decide which way you prefer it. So that looks quite good as well. You can see how now it looks like these all sort of go together, the little leaves. But I think, could go either way, couldn't I? I think I'm going to do it this way. So once I've decided, what I tend to do is put the right side on top of the left side like that. And I create myself nice little neat stacks ready to be stitched together. So let's look at how basting a stripe is going to look and how you can again get different looks with that. So got our 2 stripe pieces like so. Now this is actually a double-sided fabric, so I could have just basted it that way. But so when you're working with a stripe, what I like to do is make sure that my middle of the heart edge, which is this long one, is running in line with my stripes so that we don't get wonky stripes on our hearts. So again, I'm going to start at the bottom. Press that down. Just going to make sure that my paper has moved so I'll get that nice straight edge. Okay, so there's 1/2. When you're doing this point, you're going to make sure that you get a really nice point here. So you just be very mindful when you're folding this seam over that this stays folded, and that you're folding it over, you're getting a really nice point here. Okay, so now we have my stripes. So now I can put my stripy heart together like this, so that my stripes run down, but I can also put it together like this so that the stripes meet at the center. And if you've been really tricky and you've pattern matched, you could have it so that these stripes all line up as well. So with this one, I could go 2 ways. I could have it like this, or I could have it like that. And I think I'm just going to have it like this. So that one's ready to stitch. So I'm just going to sit and baste a few more now, and you can just baste along with me if you are working on your project at the moment or any other stitching project, and you'll see how I sort of play around with how they look when I'm, or how I consider how they're going to look when I'm basting. Now, one thing that you will notice I do when I'm basting is that I am always basting the exact same way with each shape. So I'm always starting with my bottom edge and I'm always working my way around anti-clockwise. And the reason that we do this is so that this point, this little ear that we create up here as we baste, is always in the same direction. And the reason we do that is so that when it comes to stitching our jewels together to create our hearts, these two little ears are going to sit neatly on top of each other, So you can see here there's one flap and there's the other little ear, and it sits nice and neat over the top of that one, giving me a nice flat seam at the back. Now it's going to be tempting to trim back this little tail so that you don't have so much on the back, but you do not want to do this. And the reason you don't want to do this is because if you trim this back, you're going to risk this getting a hole in this point here. If you trim this back way too much, it's not going to have the stability that you need it to have. And when you piece it together, if a hole is ever going to be created in your quilt, it's going to be created at that point where you trimmed back that fabric just too much. So leave your flappy little ears as they are. Sometimes they may be really big, but just don't worry about that. Just leave them as they are. It's safer to leave them than to trim them. So usually when I'm basting, I tend to batch baste. So for example, last night I sat down and I cut and basted a whole stack of jewels, actually the night before last. And then last night I batch stitched heart blocks together. So I stitched something like 20 heart blocks together, and it's really handy to work in this way because I can just sit and baste a whole heap of jewels and then they're ready to stitch, and then I've got a whole heap ready to stitch, and then I can stitch a whole heap of hearts together, and that's how I end up getting a whole little basket full of hearts ready to stitch. And then when I just want to sit in peace, I've got all my hearts ready to go. So I'm just determining which way I want this one to sit, and I think I'm going to sit it that way. Okay, so now that we've done basting, we're going to move on to how we piece our heart blocks together. Okay, so once we have our jewels basted, we're ready to stitch two of them together to make a heart block. So I always like to remind myself how I intended to set my hearts together. So with this one, I am definitely going to go this way. So what I'm going to do is place my right side on top of my left side, and I'm going to line up the long edge. And I like to start stitching up at what's going to be the top of the heart, so where the two short edges meet. I'm going to start here, and I'm going to stitch down the long edge or the center of the heart. And I like to do that because it's a bit easier to match up these two corners. And then when it comes to these two corners, you'll actually end up folding this little ear down so that you get your nice point here. Okay, so then I've threaded my needle, and I have a piece of thread that's not too long with a knot in the bottom. So what I'm going to do is start in the very corner, and I'm going to just take a couple of bites of fabric, bring my needle through to my knot, and then I'm going to go through again, but I'm not going to pull my needle through. What I'm going to do is a locking knot, and I do this knot at the start and end of each stitched edge. So I'm going to take what I call the working yarn, and I'm going to wrap that around over the top of my needle and under, and then I'm going to take my tail thread, and you'll have two because you've got the working thread and the end of your thread, and I'm going to go in the opposite direction. So this time I'm going to go under and around, and then I'm going to slowly pull that through, and what that creates, if you can see that there, is a little figure 8 knot. I'm going to pull that tight, and what this knot does is it's now going to secure my stitches along this edge. So if ever my thread was to for some reason break in the middle of this edge, it's only going to unravel back to this point or this point where I will do another locking knot. So now that I've done my knot, I'm just going to hold this little tail thread down, and I'm going to whip stitch all the way to the end. And when I whip stitch, I'm just putting my needle through, and I'm just picking up a couple of fibers of fabric from both of my jewels, and my needle is gliding over the top of the paper edge. And the other thing that I always make sure I do is that I put my needle in straight so that it is perpendicular or has a 90-degree angle to my paper. Doing a whip stitch this way means that my stitch is shorter and is less likely to be seen on the front. If I was to go at an angle like this, you're creating a longer stitch across the two shapes, and it has the potential to become a looser stitch and for that stitch to be seen on the front. So I like to do my whip stitch very straight across, and I like to place my stitches quite close together. A general rule of thumb is that you want at least 4 stitches per 1/4 inch. I probably do 1 or 2 more than that, just because I've gotten into the habit of doing them very close together. And I'm going to stitch all the way to the end. Okay, so now that we have got ourselves a whole selection of hearts to stitch together, I'm going to show you how we go about doing that. So there are two ways in which you can stitch your heart blocks together to create a quilt. The first way is the way that I'm doing it, which is stitching my hearts together without any kind of connecting shape. And what this means is that one row of your hearts is going to be upside down. So every second row will be upside down. And so what that means is when you're choosing what heart to put where when you're stitching together, you're going to want to think about how if you're doing an upside down row and how that heart is going to look when it's upside down. So what I have done is I've picked out a particular heart that tells me which direction my quilt is going, and that's this little heart block here with the birds. So I don't want my birds to be flying upside down. I want them to be flying normally. So this is my indication block when I'm stitching all my other blocks on, and when I'm working on the quilt as it gets larger, I can pick out this block and I'll know that that's the direction that I'm working in. So that when I'm selecting my rows for my upside down ones, I'm very careful to select hearts where it doesn't matter too much about the fabric pattern placement. For example, this one here would look very odd if it was upside down, whereas this one doesn't look too bad because it's a very all over print. Now there is a second way that you can piece your hearts together so that they are all facing the right direction. But for that, you're going to need to use a 60-degree diamond. So I'm just going to lay them out so that it gives you an idea of what that's going to look like. So if you're doing it with so that you want your hearts to be all the right way up, you're going to stitch them together like so. And then you're going to use a 60-degree diamond in these little peaks here. So in the center of your heart block, you're going to put a 60-degree diamond. Now your 60-degree diamond needs to be the same size as your jewel. So if you're using 1-inch jewels, you're going to need a 1-inch diamond, and if you're using 1.5, you'll need a 1.5. And that's because our diamond sides measure 1 inch and they need to connect with the 1-inch sides of our jewel. So you need to place your diamonds in the center of your hearts, and then when you come to piece your next row, your hearts are going to sit nice and neatly like so. And you'll continue along. That one will go there. And then you'll continue to add your jewel papers to the centers of your hearts. And you'll keep working your way like so. So that's how you can connect them so that your hearts all run in the same direction. Now there's a couple of different methods that you could use for piecing your hearts together. You could just piece one big long strip, the width that you want your quilt to be, and then just continue to add to that long strip and work your way up and back and up or down your quilt, very much like typing on a typewriter. Another way you could do it is to just create sections. So you might just do a section of hearts and then you might work on another section, and then as you build up these sections you can then stitch these sections together. Or you can work the way that I ended up going with. So originally I was going to piece one big long strip and work typewriter style, but then I realized my stitching method is a little bit more organic than that. And so I sort of started here somewhere. Actually, I started with these few hearts here, I think. And I just sort of worked my way around, up and down, picking my hearts that I wanted as I sort of went. So I would sort of work on this little bit, and then I'd go, okay, what hearts do I want to put with this bit? And so I worked on this bit. And so at the moment, it's just sort of growing to be this size. And I'm going to keep working on that. I'll get to a point widthways where I am going to stop, and then I will focus on filling in the top and filling in the bottom. But at the moment, I'm sort of working each and every way. And I just sort of pick an area and go, okay, well, I'm going to work on this little area here. And so I just work on adding my hearts to this section, and then I'll move on to a sort of different section. So when you're piecing your hearts together, you will find that you may need to fold or bend your papers every now and again as you are stitching. So for instance, to stitch this side to this one, I'm going to have to bend this one as I stitch this one. I want to try and bend it as little as possible as I can, because bending or folding your papers will weaken them, and it will mean that they won't last as long. But it's just the nature of working with jewels and the way that we stitch them together. You will need to bend them from time to time. So once I have stitched this edge together, I will then be able to remove this paper. I like to remove my papers as I go, because I can then reuse them throughout the project as I'm stitching. And it also means that I am not going to have the weight of the papers in my work. As your quilt gets bigger and the piece you're working on gets bigger, if you leave these papers in, you're going to find that this becomes quite heavy to hold, and that's not going to be very good for your wrists or your shoulders as you stitch. The other reason I like to remove my papers as I go, as it makes my work more pliable. So as I'm stitching and I'm working my way around the different shapes, it means that I can fold and I can move this freely without the stiffness of the papers being in. So what I'm going to do now is I'm just going to sort of sit and stitch for a little bit, and you're welcome to stitch along with me. And that way you'll sort of get a feel for how I work my way through piecing the hearts together. I really hope you enjoyed that tutorial and slow stitching video about making jewel hearts and how to stitch them together to create a quilt. If you are not already participating in the Connecting Hearts Sew Along, it's not too late to join and stitch along with us. As I said, it's a very informal stitch along, and we're just sharing our works in progress and what we are stitching over on Instagram and Facebook using the hashtag connectingheartsepp. If you have any questions at all, please pop them in the comments below and I will try my hardest to get to them. Similarly, you can email me or DM me on Instagram, and again, I will try my hardest to get back to you. I really hope you gained some useful tips and tricks for working with jewels and making hearts from this video. If you did enjoy the video, it would be wonderful if you could give it a thumbs up and share it with your friends, your stitchy friends. And if you haven't already subscribed to my channel, go ahead and subscribe so that you can watch more lovely slow stitching videos and see more tutorials from me, from my little studio. So I hope to see you on socials with your heart quilt. And until next time, happy stitching, friends. Bye.